When things go wrong, as they sometimes will, when the road you're trudging seems all uphill, when the funds are low and the debts are high, and you want to smile but you have to sigh, when care is pressing you down a bit, rest if you must but do not ever quit. Success is a failure turned inside out. Let's talk and clear the clouds.
Bismillah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to a new episode of Let's Talk. I'm your host Khalil Amunet. Today our topic is application of Sharia in the West. Sharia is a word that is attached to a lot of controversy, especially in the West. There are even groups devoted solely to opposing the application of Sharia. What is the actual meaning of the term Sharia is what we'd like to talk about in this episode of Let's Talk. I'd like to welcome our guest, Dr. Hatim Al-Hajj. He's the director of the Sharia Academy of America. Welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And I'd like to also welcome Sheikh Haitham Al-Haddad. He's the director of the Muslim Research and Development Foundation think tank. It aims to make solutions for Muslims living in the West. You can also visit their website, islam21c.com. Welcome, Dr. Haitham.
Hayyakallah, jazakallah khair.
Welcome, Joe. And also our in-studio audience. Assalamu alaikum and welcome. So, I'd like you to answer the first question I posed the starting of the show. Why is there so much suspicion attached to this word, Sharia?
Alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. Well, there is so much suspicion because of lack of knowledge of what Sharia is about, and because of lack of knowledge about what we mean by application of Sharia in the West. Certain people may think that we will impose Sharia on the people in the West. Certain people may think that we will establish hudud in the West. Neither is intended by the application of Sharia in the West. First of all, what is Sharia? Many times people think of Sharia, whenever the word Sharia is mentioned, to refer only to the prescribed punishments, which are part of Sharia. But if you look at how big that part is, it is part of many parts of what Sharia is about. Sharia is the way, is the path. The word in and of itself linguistically means the path to water sources or water bodies. And the similarity here between Sharia and the path to a water body is that Sharia sustains the life, the spiritual life of the individual, and also the physical life, promotes and protects the physical life of the individual, just as much as water is necessary for the sustenance of the physical body. So that's where the word comes from. So it's a whole way of life. Sharia is basically the whole revelation. Sharia is Allah's prescription for humanity, for their well-being, for their welfare. It pertains to the Aqidah, and it pertains to matters of practical practices, such as acts of worship, transactions, customs, traditions, punishments, judiciary system. So it is much more comprehensive than many people may think. So if they understand what it means, when I make wudu, I am implementing Sharia.
Okay.
So there is no way that Muslims can live without Sharia. When I say Allahu Akbar to start my prayer, that is part of Sharia. When I fast, that is Sharia. And it is not conceivable that Muslims may do away with any of that.
So, Dr. Haitham, so Sharia can differ from one place to the other in that case, since you cannot apply, when we're talking about Sharia, we don't necessarily have to apply hudud, for example, in the West.
Yeah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. The implementation of Sharia in the West has to be understood carefully. Otherwise, as the Sheikh said, that it is normally misunderstood. What do we mean by it? Implementation of Sharia in the West. First of all, to apply Sharia in a certain location, in a certain society, you need to have prerequisites. And we need to go back to the life of the Prophet ﷺ and to see how the Prophet ﷺ conducted himself in terms of da'wah and in terms of calling for Sharia to be implemented. In the beginning, the Prophet ﷺ called people to endorse Islam, and in particular the elite, because once the elite will endorse Islam, the rest of the people will likely to follow them. And once most of the people endorse Islam, they would like to see Islam as the governance body, and then they will implement Sharia themselves. So it is not imposed on people who do not accept Islam in the first place. It is true that in certain circumstances where Muslims conquered certain lands, they would implement Sharia, but in a limited capacity based on some other circumstances. So that should be, once we talk about implementation of Sharia in the West, we are not talking about implementing Sharia in full and imposing it on the people who do not endorse Islam in the first place. Then the second question, there are Muslims living in the West.
Yes.
So those Muslims, should they implement Sharia or shouldn't they implement Sharia? First of all, this is a big question. I cannot claim that I can't answer this question. In fact, it is part of my PhD. I discussed this point and I said that maybe this needs conferences where a group of scholars can discuss this scenario. A non-Muslim country allowed some Muslims to implement Sharia in full. Can they implement it among themselves while the governance of that state does not belong to them, which means that they have kind of self-autonomy? If that happened. Now, Muslims have some freedom to implement some of their laws in South Africa and maybe in some other areas, in Philippines, etc. But anyway, this is not a point to be discussed now. This is a very advanced stage that we don't need to discuss it now. So when we discuss about implementation of Sharia by Muslim minorities, what do we mean by that? We are talking about essential elements for the well-being of the Muslim community in non-Muslim country. And in particular, matters related to ibadat. As Dr. Hatem said, when I pray, I am implementing Sharia. When I eat halal meat is regulated in most non-Muslim countries by law.
Yes.
So, which means that the law has accepted elements of Sharia. Building mosques is regulated by almost all non-Muslim countries, or most of the non-Muslim countries. So that is part of Sharia. Wearing hijab is part of Sharia, and it is regulated by, or at least accepted by, many Muslim countries. So wherever Muslims are there, Sharia is there. So how far can they go? This is the question. Hijab, the personal matters should be conducted according to Sharia. Are there any other elements of Sharia that they need and they must implement other than their personal ibadat, acts of worship? Here, one of the elements that they need to strive to implement is the application of the Muslim personal law. The Muslim personal law. Matters related to matters related to nikah, matters related to talaq, dissolution of marriage, inheritance, and related matters. Because these matters, Muslims cannot live without them. Muslims cannot, a male Muslim cannot cohabit with a Muslim lady because of any other system other than the Islamic system, which is Sharia, which is marriage. A Muslim cannot inherit from someone other than through the Islamic system. So a Muslim cannot live without the Muslim personal law wherever he resides. So Muslims in non-Muslim countries should strive to implement at least the basics of Muslim personal law among themselves, and in order for that implementation to be effective, they should seek the judicial approval of what they implement. So the Muslim personal law can be incorporated within the judicial system in many non-Muslim countries. And here I recall the experience of South Africa, where, you know, Muslims in South Africa have a good position. So I've been told when I was doing my research that in 80 something, 82, the system, no, in fact after the apartheid, they called Muslims to have the Muslim personal law codified so they can incorporate it in the judicial system. Unfortunately, the disunity among Muslims around this subject caused the delay of this, and I don't know whether the government wiped out this offer or not. Muslims there, they were differing on a point. Either, some of them said, either we implement it on full or we don't implement it. We can't fragment the implementation of Sharia. So we can't apply Muslim personal law only and leave the rest of Sharia.
Well,
so the government has to give us all Sharia or none. That was the position of some Muslims, but the rest of the Muslims, they said, no, whatever is given to us, in fact, it might not be appropriate for us as a minority to implement Sharia in full. So let us implement at least the Muslim personal law. So the implementation, in summary, the implementation of Muslim personal law, or in fact, to be more precise, the incorporation of Muslim personal law within the judicial system, is what Muslims are intending and Muslims are calling for in the West. They are not calling for the implementation of Sharia in full in the West. Why? Simply because the premise, the ground for that does not exist in the first place.
It would require a separate state with police force and we're talking about full Islamic Sharia implementation, which is capital punishment, hudud, all that type of thing, which requires a law enforcement and such, which is a separate state, which it can't really happen.
It actually, in confederal systems, this could happen.
Yeah,
and
that's true.
if they allow the Muslims, let's say there's a Muslim minority that is a significant Muslim minority in one particular country, let's say India, and they allowed the Muslims in certain governances in India to rule by the Sharia, then it is almost the agreement of the scholars that being empowered by the non-Muslim community to implement the Sharia, that they must implement the Sharia, because فَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ مَا اسْتَطَعْتُمْ, fear Allah as much as you can. And if he can implement the Sharia, then وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ وَلَا مُؤْمِنَةٍ إِذَا قَضَى اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ أَمْرًا أَن يَكُونَ لَهُمُ الْخِيَرَةُ مِنْ أَمْرِهِمْ. It is not appropriate or fitting for a believing man or a woman when Allah and His Messenger decide on a matter that they have an option regarding their affairs, to choose, to take or to not. Ibn Abdin in Al-Hashiyya, and which is Hanafi, and Ibn Farhun in Tabsirat al-Hukam, which is Maliki, and Al-Juwayni in Qiyas al-Umam, which is Shafi'i, and Abu Ya'la in Al-Ahkam al-Sultaniyya, which is Hanbali, which means all the four madhahib, recognized madhahib. They said that if given the power, they should take it, and they should either accept the qadis that are hired by the non-Muslim governor, the Muslim qadis that are hired by the non-Muslim governor, or if he allowed them to choose their own qadis, then they must appoint their own qadis. So that is a little bit
But that's not
too
the West,
rosy.
though. That's not our situation in the West.
It may be too rosy in the West, but it may be possible in some places where the Muslim minorities have
been there for thousands of years,
have been
actually. Yeah.
are more established. So there is usually we're talking about judicial system. When people talk about Sharia, they're talking about the judicial system. We said it is much bigger than this, but even in the judicial system, there is judgment, there is judging, which is the work of the qadi. There is arbitration, which is tahkim, which is the work of the muhakkam in Sharia. There is mediation, which is wasata, to mediate between people, to settle matters between them. And then there is counseling. So if they give us all the way up to arbitration, we take it.
Yes.
If they give us all the way up to mediation, we take it. You know, certainly counseling, no one can prevent people from counseling.
No.
People.
That's what most masajid do in the West, is counseling.
But whatever seating is given to us, I think that we should not fall short of utilizing all the room that was given to us to live according to the Sharia. Yet we should not penetrate that ceiling.
Okay. That's all the time we have for this segment. Please stay with us.
Allah is beautiful and He loves beauty. So is it logical to say all plastic surgeries are lawful in Islam to bring or to regain beauty? It is very misleading questions. Need a very accurate and firm answers. Let us set up the rules and principles to cover all plastic surgeries in Islamic law. How Islam does legalize niqab or veil factor in our modern life? Is it fair to suggest that it is more cultural than it is Islamic? I would rather to answer these questions by just suggesting very shocking fact about niqab. Are you ready for that? How Islam does legalize polygamy, when Islam always says that respect natural instinct and natural feelings, and knowing that not a single woman does accept anyone to share her in her kingdom. All what you have said is true. But is there any difference between your natural instinct and your natural desires? Or maybe between your interest or what you wish to have? Or maybe your interest and other interest? Is it true that anything came after the Prophet ﷺ regarding this deen to be considered as a bid'ah, innovation? Is neither this nor that? It seems very well complicated and confusing to many Muslims, especially when it comes to the saying of the Prophet ﷺ, وَكُلَّ مُحْدَثَةٍ بِدْعَةٍ, and Sayyidina Umar saying, نِعْمَةُ الْبِدْعَةُ هَذِهِ. Let us set up the very comprehensive definition of bid'ah according to Islamic law.
Welcome back. We're just speaking about the implementation of Sharia law in the West. In the United States, for example, you're the director of an organization called the Sharia Academy of America. What is that organization's role? Does it implement Sharia, or is there such an organization that does?
Well, Sharia Academy of America is an educational institution. It gives bachelor, master's, PhD in Islamic studies. So it is not an organization that implements Sharia. But there is the Assembly of Muslim Jurists in America, which is an organization that promotes Sharia in a way that is not in conflict with local laws. So it pretty much utilizes, as I said in the previous segment, all the room that's available, that is made available for us to have programs for arbitration, in which the arbitrator would be trained in Islamic law and also trained in the legal system, the local legal system, so that he wouldn't cross red lines and within the context of his arbitration. And And that particular experience has been met with a lot of doubt on the part of people who are opposed to Sharia. And in fact, Amjad has been attacked several times by such, so-called think tanks and activists that are particularly opposed to Sharia. Sometimes it's because of ignorance, and sometimes it is because of just stranger and anxiety. Children have a condition called stranger anxiety. It starts at about 9 months of age, peaks around 18 months of age, and then starts to go away by 3 years of age. And for some people, it carries on.
It carries on.
Any
strange word is attached with suspicion.
Any strange
or culture,
appearance or culture or habit, custom, tradition gives people a little bit of an anxiety. People who were not able to outgrow that stranger anxiety.
Okay. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Hatem. Are you aware of in the United States there is a state called Tennessee, and they want to ban Sharia there, which will result in people not being allowed to make wudu in public or praying in public. What do you advise to these people in the Muslim community there?
I think those are extremely extreme fragment or segments of the society that would go as far as banning wudu in public or prayer in public. But what is more possible is the banning of Sharia law, and I think that the law did pass to ban the use of Sharia law within the judicial system in America, and I think in that particular state. So the law did pass, but it does not have to do with personal matters. It is basically to prohibit American judges from considering Sharia law.
Okay, so in a case where like a Muslim couple get married and they get married Islamically through an imam or Muslim judge or whoever, and then they want a divorce, and perhaps the female goes to a judge for divorce and just gets a divorce from the court and does not do the Islamic way, which has some conflicts. So is that where this law banning Sharia would apply?
They're basically addressing their own judges to not consider the Sharia or its regulations in a case like this, or in any case that pertains to Muslims. So let's say that the husband will bring a sheikh or imam or a Sharia expert to testify on his behalf that what he did with her was within what is considered permissible in Sharia. Then the judge is barred from acting upon this information or even listening to it.
Okay. Do you have any more questions?
Yeah. Assalamu alaikum. Dr. Hatem, my question is basically sort of an extension from the previous question. I'd like to know, what does someone do when they're living in the West and they find themselves in a position where basically, if they were to act upon the Sharia, they're going against the law, the law of the country.
Well, alhamdulillah, the Sharia gave us enough flexibility to not cause us much hardship. But in personal matters and matters of worship and, in personal matters, you will not find much difficulty living by the Sharia. In matters of worship, you will not find difficulty living by the Sharia, except for the inconvenience, so that, you're out in the street and you don't have, masajid nearby and things of that nature, but no one is preventing you from praying or fasting or, giving your zakat out or making hajj, etc. It gets a little bit more complicated when it comes to transactions, whether those interactions or transactions are in the financial sector or family laws, it will require the cooperation of two individuals. In this case, that's why when you get married, you want to get married to someone who's righteous, that will submit to the law of Allah and the guidance of the Sharia without needing any enforcement from the law enforcement agencies, because the law enforcement agencies will not enforce the laws of Sharia. So you want someone who will internally monitor themselves and make sure that they are compliant with Sharia. In the financial arena, that is where arbitration comes in. Like if you disagree with a Muslim or you have a dispute with a Muslim over some transaction that took place between you, then if the law allows us to do this, then it is binding on us, not only that we submit to the law of Allah, but also it would be binding on us that we state in our contract that we will seek arbitration, Islamic arbitration, to resolve any disputes that will stem from this contract.
So that's a sort of solution for Muslims in the West.
Because ما لا يتم الواجب إلا به فهو واجب. Whatever is required for completing your obligations or for fulfilling your obligations is obligatory in and of itself. So if it is obligatory on us to submit to the Sharia and to abide by the Sharia, and this measure would enable us to actually do that, then when two Muslims come together and start like a company or something of that nature,
they can agree.
If the law allows us to do this, actually the law does allow people
so you write in your contract
to seek arbitration of their own choosing.
Okay.
Yeah, particularly in financial matters. Maybe in family law it's a little bit more complex.
So Dr. Haytham, you live in Great Britain. What is your experience? Is it different from what Dr. Hatem was talking about in the USA?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I'm also part of the Islamic Sharia Council in the UK. Islamic Sharia Council in the UK is an organization set up by a number of Muslim organizations and dignitarians. It was set up in 1982 to act as a court for Muslims only in the Muslim personal law. The biggest problem Muslims face in non-Muslim countries are problems related to the personal law. The biggest among those problems is the issue of marriage dissolution.
Yeah.
Nikah can be done easily. You don't need a court. It can be done with an imam, even without an imam. It can be done once the conditions of nikah are met. Financial transactions, as the Sheikh said, that almost all Anglo-Saxon based laws or legal systems accept arbitration. In America, arbitration is binding. In Britain, arbitration in financial matters is binding as well, and so on. So what is left is the Muslim personal law. Within the Muslim personal law is the issue related to marriage dissolution. Why marriage dissolution? Because marriage dissolution, you need an external authority to dissolve the marriage. External authority means an entity that receives power from the state. It has a judicial power in order to enforce the decision on the subjects. So that, which is the marriage dissolution, is a serious problem. Yes. Islamic Sharia Council was set in Britain, and it is a unique experience, to be honest with you, in 1982. And in Europe, there is no Sharia, no similar Sharia Council, as far as I know, at least until maybe just 2-3 years. In America, what I came to know is recently in California, I think, there was one Sharia council that has been established. Is a small, a small place, a small organization. But this marriage dissolution, what I knew that in America is being decided by the imams.
Yeah.
Marriage dissolution is quite sensitive, and it is an example of how Muslims can conduct their affairs in a non-Islamic judicial system. In Muslim countries, the marriage dissolution is taken place by the Qadi, who receives his authority from the head of the state. So there is no possibility of conflict between decisions taken by different Qadis or different judges. While because there is an absence of a single authority in non-Muslim countries, single Islamic authority in non-Muslim countries, then there might be a conflict between a decision taken by one Sharia council and then a decision taken by another Sharia council. That's why we call upon Muslims living as minorities to unite themselves, at least in these matters, and to have one single authority to decide on these things, at least on these things. We are trying to achieve this in Britain, and to in order to set an example for other European countries in the first place. And many European countries are contacting us in the Islamic Sharia Council in order to copy that model. In fact, in 2 years ago, we received delegates from Austria. From Norway. Okay. Non-Muslim delegates, and they were discussing our experience as an Islamic Sharia Council, and I asked them, they said, we are just exploring the possibility of having a similar setup within their judicial system. So this is our experience in Britain. In America, I feel that they are more privileged by having the confederal or the federal system, because what I understood is the federal system allows each state to govern its internal affairs according to what they decide, even to the level that Yusuf Estes, I remember, he told me, do you know that Texas and some other states, they have the right to split them to independence on a unilateral agreement. Means that they can, when they joined America, they joined under this this condition, that unilaterally they can decide to be independent.
It is sort of an independent country itself even now, but there's a whole war about this.
Which means that the freedom for Muslims in America to have the Sharia law in terms of personal law is more than what we have in Britain. In fact, the prenuptial agreement is the agreement before marriage, is binding in America, and it is not binding in Britain. It might be addressed in Britain, but it is not binding. Moreover, in America, on separation, you can't decide in prenuptial agreement, you can decide that the wife does not get half of the wealth upon separation. That is not allowed in Britain. You can't have this. So Americans for the first time have some advantages over us in Britain. But we are exploring these things in order for our audience, because we have a large type of audience from different countries. They can explore these possibilities, and they should find, I don't want to use the word loophole, but where the law allows them
to enforce the Sharia.
To not enforce, to have certain elements of Sharia implemented within the judicial system, to have that chance. and not to have disputes among themselves, so they lose the chance. And I always regret that Muslims in Britain started to lobby the government to have Sharia incorporated within the judicial system. Long time ago, we would have won that. Because, you know, after 9/11, the situation and then the way they perceive us and the prejudice increased. So now is very difficult to have that. So if in other non-Muslim countries, in Africa or in maybe Asia, in Sri Lanka and other places where Muslims can achieve this, then they should jump into that opportunity and they should implement it as much as they can.
That's all the time we have for this segment. Please don't go away. Welcome back, and thank you for staying with us. We're just having an interesting discussion about the application of the Sharia law in the West. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Yes, I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
My question is, as Muslims, what can we do to give Sharia a more favorable view to non-Muslims and tell them, I guess, the positive aspects of it?
So, Dr. Hatim, how can we sell Sharia law to the non-Muslims as a sort of as a solution for some of the problems, social problems that are rampant in the West?
Yes, alhamdulillah. Well, I think that you need to have a bird's view of Sharia, and you need to identify the areas that are easier to sell to the West, or easier to convince the West of. There are areas like family laws, for instance, are somewhat harder, maybe a lot harder, than financial laws.
Like no interest is very easy to sell.
Prescribed punishments would be harder than family laws, and so on and so forth. So you have to identify the areas that are easiest to convince them of. This is not imposing Sharia on them. This is showing them the favorable outcomes of the implementation of Sharia. In fact, we had a golden opportunity that we did not utilize appropriately with the collapse of the financial system.
Yes.
Had we really been more proactive, and had we really been more, had we really crafted a model for the West, or models
some
for
institutions,
the West, financial models for the West, and presented them in a way that is convincing, it was actually quite a prime opportunity, because the West did not only recognize, during the financial collapse, did not only recognize the weaknesses within the financial system, but it also started to recognize, maybe not at the level of the common media, but think tanks, academicians, financial experts, universities in America, Ivy League universities in the United States are teaching Islamic economics now. People started to talk about the alternative, Islamic alternative. In fact, it was an editorial of the official paper of the Vatican that said that in order for the Western banks to regain the confidence of their customers or clients, they must learn the basics of Islamic banking or Islamic financing. This is not the Financial Times, although we had similar statements, or quite similar statements, by the Financial Herald Tribune, the Financial Times, Sydney Herald Tribune, Financial Times, Le Finance in France, etc. But when this comes from the official paper of the Vatican, which is the Observatory, I don't speak Italian, so forgive my accent or if I massacred the word, but anyway, the editorial of the Observatory, which had this statement about Islamic banking. So when this comes from the official paper of the Vatican, it is quite remarkable. It's quite significant, and it indicates that we may have missed a great opportunity because of our lack of organization or lack of preparedness and lack of willingness to come out of the closet and to show the people what we have. Each and every failure in the system that resulted in the collapse had an Islamic remedy. It was actually a major prohibition in Islam. So the usury that created the bubble in the mortgage system is prohibited in Islam, because the problem with usury is when the bank gives you $400,000 for a house that's worth $200,000, the bank makes more profit than if it gave you $200,000
to buy.
To buy the house. So the bank doesn't really care about the actual price of the house. The bank just wants to give you money and more money to make more profit. Also and then the bank does not care about you defaulting on the contract, or because
they'll seize your property or whatever.
Because they are insured also, and that's the other problem that Islam would have prevented, because they are insured. The problem is they did not foresee the magnitude of the collapse that would not only result in the collapse of one bank, but the collapse of many banks, and subsequently the collapse of the insurance companies, which meant the complete breakdown of the system, because the insurance companies now cannot make the banks up for their losses. And then the sale of debt is another big problem that took place, that resulted in the domino effect, because one mortgage was sold more than 40 times. It ended up being bought by a bank in Japan. So the collapse in America resulted in vibrations all over the place, and collapse all over the place because of the sale of debt, or the sales of debt, which is prohibited in Islam. So each and every problem that took place that resulted in this very bad outcome had some fix in Islam. We didn't present this quite clearly.
Well, perhaps there's no such thing as Islamic banks in America. Have you ever heard of Islamic bank being established in the West?
I think that going back to Sheikh Haytham's statement about Americans being more privileged, I think they are more privileged in this particular regard, because they do have some Islamic financial organizations or institutions that are a little bit ahead of us in America. And in America, there are some companies that provide...
Like home loans, I've heard of that. Do we have any other questions from the audience?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum. There are people right now that are striving to make Sharia law in the West, but shouldn't they at least start off in the major Muslim countries? And another question is, for like this brother said, one of the brothers mentioned, like the religion is limited, like you can't do wudu publicly, you can't do salat publicly. That means the religion is limited. If the religion is limited, shouldn't they at least make hijrah? Is hijrah obligatory on them?
Are there any countries that are prohibit? I don't think there are any countries that prohibit prayer, but do you have to make hijrah where you can't apply certain aspects of the Sharia? And what are these aspects of the Sharia that...
Well, this living in a non-Muslim country, the scholars have discussed this in details, and there is a lot of discussion about it. But generally speaking, before jumping into the classical answer that has been provided by scholars, we need to explore the options available for Muslims living in non-Muslim countries. And let us not talk about Muslims living in the West. If we want to talk about a general principle, we need to talk about all minorities, not just Muslims living in the West. We should talk about Muslims living in India, because classically, or maybe according to the definition of minority, they are living as minority, although maybe they reach to 200 million Muslims. Muslims living in China, they are living as minority, although according to some statistics 100 million Muslims living in China, or at least 50 million Muslims. 50 million Muslims, maybe half of the population of Arab countries, does not reach to this. So if we want to say that those Muslims, they should immigrate or do hijrah and leave these countries, then we should talk about them. Where shall they live? Well, Egypt is able to host 2 million Indian Muslims, or Saudi Arabia, or Tunisia, or Syria maybe. Yeah.
Syria, I think, has room.
Okay.
So we should probably stay away from Syria now.
This is a question. So before jumping into the classical answer, we need to explore the possibilities. You know, if a person is striving to death in the desert, and he is asking for a fatwa, is it allowed for him to eat from the dead meat or not? We can't say is it allowed or is not allowed unless we know his situation, the context of the fatwa. Is he starving to death, or he finds other possibilities? So it is not right to say, yes, it is haram for you to eat from the dead flesh. If he says, well, I'm dying, then we say, no, you must eat from the dead flesh. So this, I know this is a dilemma that many young Muslims have. So this is one thing. The other thing is, many Muslims tried hijrah in numerous situations to some Muslim countries, and it didn't work for them for political or social political reasons. And then they went back to the West, but they went back and they went to square one. So instead of just repeating this and losing time, we call for Muslims living as minorities, whether in the West or elsewhere, to try to establish themselves. And even I was having an idea to have like a fatwa body for Muslims living as minorities, not just Muslims living in the West. And maybe Dr. Hatim can give us some feedback on this matter. Why? Because we want more of communication between ourselves, and we need to exchange our experiences. Muslims in South Africa are more advanced than, for example, Muslims in some other African countries, let alone Muslims maybe in Burma. There are millions of Muslims in Burma, and they are subject to kind of hostility from the state there.
Due to the despotism, the very strict government that they have.
Yeah, okay. There are Muslims in Singapore. Wherever you go, there are some minorities. So how do we deal with these minorities? And that's why we call upon the big Islamic organization, whether the OIC or the Muslim World League, to try to be more proactive in providing solutions and help, support, all types of support, not necessarily financial support, to those Muslims. We have we have how many Muslims in Russia? 70 million or something like this in Russia. And they are indigenous Russian Muslims. You are from Russia, are you from Russia? How many Muslims do we have there? I think 70 or 60 millions.
It's whatever. A pretty big number. Right?
So yeah, so we need a comprehensive solution.
Maybe that was in the USSR. Maybe Russia now has about 25.
Yes, yes, you are.
Well, there's plenty
of
USSR.
Yeah. So it is the scale of the problem is quite big. And that's why we say to Muslims, they need to learn the experience of other Muslims, and they need to look positively as citizens of that country, whatever that country is, and they need to look at themselves as Muslims who need to establish themselves. And see, we don't need to lose hope. Syria and some Lebanon and even Iraq, before they became Muslim countries, they were non-Muslim countries. And Muslims migrated to those countries, and they started as a small number. After some time, they accepted Islam. Indonesia, Malaysia, they accepted Islam through merchandise and business men. So let us not lose hope and think that, oh, Islam will not be established whether in the West or in some other non-Muslim countries.
Okay, that's all the time we have. Dr. Hatem, do you have any conclusionary remarks?
No, I just wanted to say that internal migration sometimes works. Like if you migrate from one city to another city or from one state to another state, whether it's after an Islamic school for your kids or a better environment, more tolerant people, etc. So internal migration works, and to familiarize and acquaint yourself with a Muslim country of your choosing, you pick a Muslim country and familiarize yourself and your kids with that country so that they do have an alternative in case they needed it. That would also be helpful.
And you need to establish Muslim communities, obviously, and you can't do that with everybody constantly moving around the place. Yeah. Okay, that's all the time we have. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Thank you very much, Dr. Hatem, and thank you also, Dr. Hatem. And I'd like to thank our studio audience. Thank you guys for showing up. That's all the time we have. I'd like to remind you guys of our email address, talk@huda.tv. You can leave any feedback you had about the episode. Thank you for watching. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
When things go wrong, as they sometimes will, when the road you're trudging seems all uphill, when things go wrong, as they sometimes will, when the road you're trudging seems all uphill, when the funds are low and the debts are high, and you want to smile but you have to sigh, when care is pressing you down a bit, rest if you must, but do not ever quit. Success is a failure turned inside out. Let's talk and clear the clouds of doubt. Success is a failure turned inside out.